The Lord.
There are a lot of narratives within that 11 verse psalm that we just had read before us, and we could talk about all kinds of subject matters out of this just one psalm and the various things that it presents to us. I want us to focus on that statement that's made there in verse 1, where the writer wants us to appreciate that God is a very present help, and I want to emphasize the word present. The fact that God is immediately available to those who will seek Him. God has never, I want to be careful because there are times where God chooses to distance Himself because of the sins and transgressions of men. But anyone who's been penitent, anybody willing to repent, anyone willing to be part of a remnant of those who will follow after and seek after God, God has always been available to that body of people. That God has always made Himself present and available to those who would seek Him because He's not far from any of us. I got to thinking about this text, though, as it relates to a more modern kind of moment that we all witnessed here in the past couple of weeks, and that was this scene. If you follow football at all, you know that a couple of weeks ago, well, I guess about a week and a half now, but there was an incident at a football game where one of the players went into cardiac arrest right in the middle of the field. And they rushed to him and were actually able to save him. And I saw pictures yesterday where he was actually visiting his teammates there in Buffalo, even yesterday, that quickly from this very sobering scene. But here's the point I want you to recognize. You see what they're doing? They're praying. When that scene occurred, the mindset of those who were there in one of the most helpless and feeling hopeless moments, they gathered together to pray. And I get to thinking about that. And so what comes to mind when we see that scene of these some of the strongest, right? These are some of the largest human beings to walk the face of the earth. They deal in physical things constantly in their lives. And they hit a point where they knew nothing else to do in that moment but to kneel down and pray. Maybe when we see this scene, we obviously, I would hope, would initially have concern for the young man who nearly lost his life on that field. And what a sobering set of circumstances that had to have been for a lot of folks, particularly those who were present in witnessing that scene unfold. Maybe we would have for a moment thoughts of how fragile life can be. One minute we're in the midst of seeking a playoff, potentially ball game that has effects upon how this football league works, and the next minute we're not even thinking about any of that. We're thinking about this fragility of life that was on display. Maybe for a moment we were thankful that there were people who chose in that moment to kneel and pray, and to kneel and beseech the Father on behalf of this young man who laid there in need of not just the medical help that he was receiving, but the help of a Creator who was a present help, as Psalm 46 illustrates. But there was something else that I saw not long after these scenes began to unfold, maybe a day or so, that troubled me. And it was something like this, where folks became frustrated that prayer could happen in the midst of the game in a tragedy, but it couldn't happen before the game. And here's where that took me. How do you and I know whether people prayed before that game or not? No, maybe nobody grabbed a microphone and went over the public PA system and offered a prayer before that game began. But how do you and I know whether or not people were praying or not praying? before that began. And what it instilled in me was an appreciation for the fact that there are still a lot of human beings walking around on this earth that know when there is challenge and difficulty and you feel hopeless, there is a God. And they may not understand the fullness of that God in their lives yet, and they may not understand all the aspects of what they need to do in relationship to that God. They may not have a grasp on all those things. Again, I don't know these individuals, but I do know this, that a bunch of them knew that in that moment the right thing to do, and in some senses the only thing they could think of to do, was to kneel before the Father. And I'll take comfort in that. I'll take comfort in the fact that there are still individuals. No, there wasn't a public prayer before the game, but there were still a whole host, and dare I even say, a majority who knew that they should go to the Father. And what I want us to appreciate this morning, folks, is simply this. I think we are still at times guilty of letting a few define for us the whole. And yes, sometimes the minority can get into positions of authority and power where they can remove a public prayer from the beginning of a ball game, where they might be able to remove certain aspects of God in reference to acknowledging Him in certain circles. And that small or few number of individuals are now in some ways looking to define the whole. And I'm saying that's not the case when I witness this right here. When I witness this, that tells me there are still a lot of general believers that sought the Father. And I'm not going to take this kind of moment and use it as a moment of frustration to shake my fist and say, well, why couldn't you have done that before the game? And I'm just going to be thankful that they did. That they sought the present help of the Father. And that maybe our world has more of those kinds of folks than we realize. Maybe our world isn't as dark as the small number of people want us to picture it as. I'm not saying our world doesn't have troubles. I'm not saying that there isn't vile sins being committed on a daily. I'm not saying that our world has completely abandoned all things sinful and has embraced all things godly. That's not my point. But my point is there are a whole lot of folks that are still seeking the present help of the Father, and I'm going to take solace in that. I'm going to take courage in that. I'm going to see some hope in that, rather than despair as we talked about last week. I'm going to show appreciation for the fact that the response was to turn to the very present help of the Creator. I want you to notice this psalm. I want you to know, with that all, way too long an introduction, I know. But now that you've got the thought that I'm driving at today, I want you to notice the psalm now in light of that. Notice verse 2. Therefore we will not fear. Why? Because God is a present help. Well, what if? What if the earth were removed? He's still a present help. What if the mountains were carried and tossed over into the sea? And the psalmist said, God's still a present help. What I want us to appreciate, folks, is that this world may have all kinds of twists and turns to it. This world may be challenged at times and have blessing at times. There may be moments where things are wonderful and things are not so good. There may be times where God is being glorified and honored because men are seeking His help and encouragement, and other times where men have turned their backs on God. But none of that will change the fact that God is still present for any and all who will turn to Him. He is a present help. And if this world would become desolate, the earth be removed, if the mountains were shaken in such a way that they were tossed into the sea, it wouldn't remove God. Friends, you can remove People in authority, people in charge of stadiums, people in charge of leagues, people in charge of school systems, people in charge of whatever, can say and make rules that say you can't pray before this ball game. You can't acknowledge God before this event. They can make rules about those kinds of things. You can't remove God from anywhere. You can't. You can choose, man can choose to ignore Him. Man can choose to not have any desire to follow Him. But He's present everywhere. From a football field in Cincinnati to a school system in West Virginia to a government building in Washington, D.C., you can't remove the presence of God. The earth can be removed. The mountains could be chucked into the sea, but you can't remove God. And so long as He's there, men can seek Him. So long as He's present, so long as the opportunities are there, there's opportunities to seek Him. And just because systems and institutions may not choose to view Him in the same way that they once did, doesn't mean He's gone anywhere. I'm trying to encourage us all to realize that. The institutions of this world and the rule makers of this world and the authorities of this world don't determine where God is and where God isn't. And these men on that football field that day proved it. Because they didn't care what the rules were. They knelt to pray. Notice verse 5. God is in the midst of her. She shall not be moved. God shall help her just at the break of dawn. He hasn't gone anywhere. Even as the psalmist might write this in the midst of his enemies, even when these words might be being penned and thought of and considered, when there's great difficulty and challenge in that moment, God hasn't gone anywhere. He's in the midst of her. God is present any and all the time. And some say, well, why did it take this tragic scene for all of a sudden prayer to become acceptable? And again, number one, I want to stop us and pause, because now I'm judging whether or not men were prayerful before on their own. But the other part of that I want us to appreciate is the Bible's filled with examples of where people hit rock bottom in order to realize they needed to look up to God. How many times in the Old Testament did God have to kind of shake His own people and knock them down to rock bottom so that they would look up? Tragedy and hardship and difficulties have always been a catalyst for folks to turn to something bigger than themselves for answer and hope and help. And so I don't want to view scenes like that we saw over the past couple of weeks. I don't want to view scenes like that with skeptics' eyes. I don't want to view it with eyes of criticism. I want to view it with eyes of folks who recognize that God was in the midst, if they would turn to the help and aid that He could offer to them. Because that's who I am some days. When I hit rock bottom and I have to be woke up to the realities of a circumstance, when I see tragedy and difficulty, and yes, sometimes by my own choosing, and the problems that we sometimes create for ourselves, I'm thankful for a God who remains in our midst that we can turn to and humble ourselves before and kneel before and pray before and beseech for the help that He will offer to any and all who will recognize that they are in His midst. Notice verse 6. Though the heathen or nations raged, the kingdoms were moved, He uttered His voice, and the earth melted. Though though the heathen or the nation, though the societies may give themselves over to things not godly, though kingdoms, though government systems, though societies come and go, right? We still teach that in our school systems. Teach them about societies that have come and gone and cultures that have come and gone over the ages and what we know about them and why they existed to begin with and how they ended up depart. We study those kinds of things. It's been around forever. And the psalmist wants us to recognize that there are going to be times where the heathen rages, where sin seems to be so prevalent that you can't turn one way or the other and not see it. But God can still speak and the earth will still melt. And though kingdoms may not be honoring Him and governments may not beseech Him anymore, and maybe their decisions and their choices, whether it be societally or governmentally or authoritatively or whatever it might be, the choices and decisions from the top may not be what the people really need in relationship to God. But it doesn't diminish what God can do. I think that's an important aspect for us to appreciate. God's power is not affected by whether or not men seek Him. His ability to act is not affected by whether a kingdom or a nation decides to honor Him. And you can't diminish who He is. That's the point I'm making. He will always be a present. He's always going to be who He is. Men change. Kingdoms come and go. Societies come and go. There are days where the heathen rages. There are days where people seek God in better ways. All of those things happen. But the one constant in all of that is always God. The one constant in that imagery and the one thing that's always present and still has all the power and ability that He has always possessed is God. And so I'll seek the present help of a God who at any moment can just speak and the earth will melt before Him. I'll kneel before a God, whether everyone does or nobody, help and assistance and aid that only He could provide. He will absolutely be exalted because He is that place of refuge. So the choice is mine. I can view scenes like that with a cynical mindset and say things like, well, it won't last or it won't. Or I can view a scene like that and appreciate the fact that there are still a lot of people who, yes, maybe had to hit rock bottom in order to say, but they're still seeking the one place and one source and the one hope and help that can be very present and available even in the most difficult of times. The Lord of hosts is with us. The Lord of hosts aids us, helps us, strengthens us. And we witnessed it. And maybe rather than find ways to be critical, I'm just simply going to thank our Creator for being present in a scary time for a lot of folks. And not only in that moment, but in a whole host of other situations and circumstances. And where the temptation might be for us to say, well, people left God out, and so because they left God out, He wasn't welcome there. And God can be wherever He chooses to be. And so long as men are still longing for Him and seeking after Him, so long as we are still seeking the help and aid that He can offer, and that this world still stands, He'll still be available to any and all who will seek Him. That was what was on my mind this week. Sometimes sermons are based on what I think I need to talk about in some kind of thought process out of Scripture, and sometimes the sermon just comes from what's floating around in my head. And that's what was floating around in my head, and I knew I couldn't get it out of there if I just didn't do it. And so I wanted to share those things with you today. I hope that that text will have more meaning to us when we see circumstances like we witnessed, and that we will take greater solace and comfort in knowing that our God is still available, and there are still a lot of people who want to look to Him. And those are open doors of opportunity then to have greater conversations about what God could really mean to them and how it could really be of benefit, not just in moments of difficulty, but every day. And it opens doors and windows. But if we're critical and we find ways to diminish what was going on, then we immediately close those doors. And now we don't have that avenue to be able to have conversations about what God could really mean in greater ways in those circumstances. Food for thought. Those are the things that were in my head over the past week. Appreciate you listening to that and studying with us out of Psalm 46 this morning. In a moment, we're going to sing this song, Zion's Call Sweetly Rings Over Land and Sea, bidding us up to realms above. Are we going to seek the heavenly home of God? We have an opportunity to make that choice and decision today. If you've yet to find remission of sins through baptism, if yet to restore your relationship with God if need be, that call continues to ring. That appeal to men to come and to seek God will always be available so long as this earth stands. And if we could aid you in making that choice and decision this morning, encourage you to do that, and we'd invite you to come as we stand.